China has a Bigfoot, and it's called the Yeren, which means the wild man or the wild person. In the 1970s, there was actually a state-sponsored investigation. They went west into Hubei province to an area that's called Shenongjie Park, which is a national park. There were legends, and many people claimed to see the Sasquatch creature. It, generally speaking, had the same kind of profile as our Bigfoot. It was between 6 and 7 feet tall, and it was seen in the 1970s frequently. During one of the sightings, plaster casts were taken of the footprint, which showed a certain kind of foot pattern where it sort of ran on the balls of its feet, and the heel wasn't touching the ground. Then in the 1990s, there was another sighting of the Yeren, and this time it was an individual sunning itself, and when it was a park ranger cried out to it, it basically just recognized him as a person and then slowly walked off on two legs bipedally. Then in 2005 there was another sighting, and this time it was a farmer, and he came across two of the Yeren, which were around 7 feet tall. They supposedly had hair from the top of their head to the basically down to their feet, except for on their face. And he nervously cleared his throat, coughed to try to let them know he was there. Once they recognized he was there, then they slowly retreated back into the woods. Today's episode, we're going to look at the Chinese Bigfoot, or the Yeren, and talk a little bit about what does it mean in Chinese culture, and as usual, draw some images and discuss the trope. But we're also going to look at the way in which the Yeren and other wild men tropes are used to kind of distinguish between an us and a them. Who are the people inside our tribe and who are the people outside our tribe? Who do we consider to be human? What do we consider sort of the borderline cases? And then how does this get used to treat ethnic and racial and even gender differences? So all of that's today ahead on Monsterology. Welcome. Okay, here's one of the images that I drew, and I'm going to show you how I did this. It's charcoal, and this is in China, in Hubei province, I'm suggesting here, with the Yeren there in the foreground. And this was a huge oil painting that I did and wrestled with for a long time, showing Chairman Mao sort of taming the Yeren creature. Here I'm doing some sketches to try to get ready for the painting. The Yeren story really raises this question about the wild man as a kind of archetype, because we see it appearing in so many different cultures, and it has such similar features. It tends to be focused on the question about boundaries between the human and the non-human, what qualifies as human and what is sort of maybe a part of our prehistory or is uncivilized. Even in our earliest stories, like in the Epic of Gilgamesh, we meet the wild man Enkidu, who has to be, in a sense, civilized. The story there is sort of strange because he becomes civilized by having sex with a prostitute for like a couple of weeks, and somehow this transforms him into a human. I don't know what that means. I don't think anyone else does either, but it's fascinating. A lot of times there's a kind of fear of the wild man or the wild person, but also we want to embrace this as part of ourselves, kind of our, maybe some kind of regression to our inner selves. It raises questions of authenticity and also interesting questions about extinction, like is this someone like us that went extinct for the most part, or is it a living fossil? Are we going to go extinct? Is the wild man or Bigfoot a kind of endangered species that we should find and try to protect? All that stuff is in play in the Chinese version as well. And I want to sort of focus later in this episode on how does this act as a kind of surrogate for treating other people as in our group or outside our group, the othering question of race, ethnicity, and so forth. I will recommend people take a look at a great book by a historian named Sigrid Schmalzer. And Schmalzer's book is called The People's Peking Man. And you'll find much more detail and rich sort of complexity in that book about the Chinese case. I'll just sort of outline a little bit of the case so you can understand what I'm doing here with the image. In the 1970s, as I mentioned, that's when there was a sort of a burst of interest in finding the Yeren in Hubei province. And in the 1970s, you have to understand that Chinese are coming out of the Cultural Revolution. The Cultural Revolution starts in 1966. It's trying to complete the revolution that Mao started back in the late 50s, and is, as many of you know, it was a fairly bloody, violent, repressive revolution in which many people were ostracized and killed. And in the 1970s, it's starting to calm down, and people are sort of coming back to their senses. There's a shift that's happening in Chinese politics away from the Soviet Union, and it's starting to open up with the United States. People will recall perhaps that Nixon goes to China in the 70s. And so the Chinese scientists and intellectuals are coming into contact with more Western popular science stuff, and that includes stuff like Bigfoot and cryptozoology. You may remember, if you're as old as I am, that the 1970s was filled with interest in Loch Ness Monster, Bigfoot, UFOs. There was a real taste for this stuff. I remember shows hosted by Leonard Nimoy and In Search Of and all kinds of stuff. So Chinese intellectuals were encountering this stuff. They were connecting it to their own tradition, which was very ancient, of the Yeren. And they were saying, well, look, maybe that's what we're seeing, and we're getting stories of some kind of hominid, some kind of creature that's been evolving all along, or a kind of missing link. And so they set out to sort of explore it. And there was some tension here because the Maoist state was anti-superstition and very much worried about folk traditions that were gullible. They hated magic. I mean, they hated religion. You may recall that Mao basically banned their own spiritual traditions of Buddhism, and he went after Confucianism. And so the idea of paranormal stuff out there in a distant province was not particularly welcomed in Beijing, but the researchers sort of countered this argument by saying, well, look, this is a scientific question, this is an evolutionary question, and we may be actually finding some kind of missing link here. And in that way, it sort of played into a kind of Cold War, a leftover Cold War battle, which was who can find, the interesting scientific data before your competitor. So here's a painting I'm doing showing Chairman Mao kind of addressing the Yeren, and obviously it's intended to have comical qualities to it, but I tried to render it as well as I could, so I'm hoping that it's both funny but also visually, aesthetically interesting. So let's sort of detour here into questions of categorizing. Here you'll see a dog, a cow, and grass. And which ones do you categorize, together first? Most Westerners categorize the dog and the cow. Most Easterners categorize the cow and the grass together at first. It raises a question, what do we use in order to categorize animals? Do we use the way they look, those characteristics, or the genetic characteristics? Linnaeus comes along and says, let's think about this with regard to human beings, and he develops fairly horrifying racial categories, and he builds in his moral dislike of other races into his classificational system and sets us off on a path of racism in the Enlightenment period that sort of we're still feeling the sting from. In his work, he actually created a side category of humanoid creatures called the wild men. And he thought these were sort of creatures living in the jungle, in the forest, and they were somewhere between the apes and human beings. Race classification before Darwin was based primarily on ideas like Linnaeus, but even older ideas from religion, connecting the different races to different animals and focusing on skin color. It was a sort of skin color-based theory, but also focused on the shape of the head. And so in racial classification after Darwin, and you see this in people like Ernst Haeckel, you still say focus on the head and the slope of the brow, But now they're connecting it illegitimately to evolution and saying some races are more evolved than others. This stuff would be totally laughable if it wasn't so sad and damaging. It had a big influence on real questions in American history, for example, with regard to abolition of slavery. Here's the only sort of significant category. The racist brain is much smaller than other brains. I get a kick out of that. But it does raise these interesting questions, about how are the races the way they are? Why do they look the way they do? And, can we trace that? With the development of molecular and then genetic classification, we began to understand that there's this very complicated story in which we're all Homo sapiens, but there's intermixing. For example, my family has a lot of Neanderthal in it, and my son's mother, who's Chinese, there's a lot of Homo erectus from the Far East. So he has a combination of Denisovan genetics and Neanderthal, as well as Homo sapiens in his genetic makeup. And so this is exciting material, but people before genetics didn't know what to do with it and didn't know how to process it. And so we tended to sort of dehumanize people who were different from us because they looked different from us. And we had certain metaphors that would bring this about. We say, oh, they're uncivilized, they have bad hygiene, weird sexual practices, they're much more like animals. This was very common. It's common in the East, it's common in the West. All human beings seem to sort of engage in this dehumanization process. And the wild man, as a kind of archetype, fed right into this. It was a way of talking about really radical difference, where you're not even in the same family. The actual differences between us, of course, just have everything to do with where our ancestors evolved. And closer to the equator and high solar radiation areas, you end up getting more melanization in the skin, and this protects you from UV rays. So our racial traits are really just the result of natural selection. It's incredibly, uncontroversial, and it's just that simple. But sort of pre-scientific humans didn't know what to do with it. So they engaged in this kind of stuff. And I would say even, people in the 20th century did this. The Nazis compared the Jewish people to vermin, to rats. In the Rwandan genocide, the Tutsis were compared to cockroaches. And this was all part of a dehumanization campaign. Oftentimes in the emigration question, people are compared to other animals or wild creatures, and this is used for political reasons. Nationalism and dehumanization, I think, is well known, and I think you'd recognize this kind of propaganda. Whenever we have an enemy or a perceived enemy, we tend to sort of monsterize them, and sometimes that uses the wild man tropes. So I think you can see there's a kind of much more interesting story to be told about some of these seemingly, pseudoscientific creatures, cryptids like Sasquatch or the Yeren. Here what I'm doing is I went and looked up imagery from Hubei province. I lived in China for a while, and I know sort of the eastern China fairly well, but have never been to this region in the west. And so I grabbed some images of these wonderful sort of Chinese road signs in a way. They're historically just beautiful. They sort of represent ideas in sort of Chinese animism in terms of spirit gates, but also ideas from Buddhism. And I'm using charcoal here that I ground into a fine powder, and then I'm basically painting on the charcoal to create that kind of value, those value relationships. And then you go in with the charcoal pencil and put a little line work in, and then you use this blending stump. Many of you who've seen a lot of my videos will recognize that the blending stump is a real go-to tool. Really helps to smooth out and create just some wonderful textures, so I highly recommend it. I looked at images of primates like howler monkeys, and then I tried to sort of adapt that to a kind of humanoid creature when I was doing this composition. And it's funny that even though scientists did not discover the Yeren or anything definitive, there are still some Chinese scientists who study it, and there are anthropologists who are interested in it. Back in the 70s, they sort of made this interesting argument. They were so influenced by, Marx and Engels and Maoist thought. They sort of accepted Engels' theory, Friedrich Engels' theory, the famous German philosopher and economist who wrote the Communist Manifesto with Marx. They accepted Engels' theory that it's labor that makes us human beings. Sort of in Latin, homo faber, we make things, and we also labor. And the argument was, well, we haven't found any trace of tools or technology in these areas where we've seen the Yeren. So for that reason, some of the Chinese scientists argued that it must not be human or humanoid. It must be outside the Homo sapiens family. I just thought that was an interesting application of sort of Marxist theory to the hunt for cryptids. It's not exactly the connection you would sort of expect to make. All right, I think this shows you a sort of classic technique with charcoal, and I grabbed the white charcoal pencil just to add a few highlights. And if you're drawing this kind of stuff, you'll know, and if not, I'm telling you, a couple of just finely added last gestures with a highlight of like white, for example, really makes the image pop and gives it a three-dimensionality. Here I'm pulling off the trusty blue artist tape, and so you can get a nice clean line, because that charcoal dust goes everywhere and it creates a kind of a mess. And so there you have it, two images of the Yeren using different techniques, and also hopefully you've enjoyed the story of this creature. And well, it ain't over yet. Maybe we're going to find the Yeren in the coming years. Fingers crossed. Okay, if you like this kind of thing, please hit the subscribe button and come back. I usually upload more content every couple weeks. All right, see you. Take care.